Hey, sustainability champions, Daniel Hartz here. Did you know we need to sequester 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide by 2050 to successfully restore the Earth's climate and atmosphere? I don't know about you, but that sounds like a lot of tons of carbon dioxide. And so today, I'm speaking with sustainability champion Dr. Erica Dodds, who is the CEO of the Foundation for Climate Restoration, who's working hard to make this a possibility. The Foundation for Climate Restoration's mission is to restore CO2 to healthy levels as quickly as possible. In fact, their goals are quite aggressive because they're aiming to go back to pre-industrial levels of CO2 in our atmosphere by 2050, as opposed to just carbon neutral. So Dr. Erica Dodds is a climate restoration and eco-anxiety expert who spends much of her time speaking about how proactive optimism is the most rational response to the existential threat of climate change. And proactive optimism, that sounds exactly like what we focus on here at Sustainability Champions. So I'm really looking forward to hearing all about this. So Dr. Dodds, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Awesome. And where are you joining the live from?
I'm in Mountain View, California.
Ah, cool. That's I'm currently based in London, but I call Los Altos, Palo Alto area my home. So
fantastic.
Yeah, very close. So today I'd like to cover really 3 things, broadly speaking. Number 1 is the work that you do at the Foundation for Climate Restoration. And then from there, this idea of eco-anxiety and proactive optimism, because I think that's really fascinating. And then third, what we can all do to be more environmentally friendly in our daily lives to move forward with away from eco-anxiety towards proactive optimism and really reach those goals of reducing and sequestering 1 trillion tons of CO2 by 2050. So how does that sound?
Sounds perfect. Let's do it.
Excellent. And for those of you who are watching this conversation live, please feel free to share your comments and questions for Erica in the chat. So I'll be watching them and we'll be doing our best to answer as many or all of them. So that's enough for me. Over to you, Erica. What exactly is this idea of climate restoration?
Yeah, I think to understand climate restoration, it helps to first think about how our current climate goals are set up. So we've been talking for decades about how we need to reduce emissions, reduce the worst impacts of climate change. And so that's really what our climate goals are focused on, is how do we stop doing so much damage to our climate? And that's critically important, right? There are so many people who are already suffering from the impacts of climate change. We have to be working on reducing those impacts. But if you think about goal setting, typically you set a goal based on what you want to have happen. And what we want to have happen is not to have the moderate impacts of climate change affecting our world, right? We want a climate that is actually safe and healthy for everyone and can support the survival and flourishing of humanity in our natural world. So climate restoration is this idea that we must do the mitigation and adaptation work that we've been working on for decades now. Absolutely critical to continue that work. And that will not get us to a safe and healthy place. So climate restoration is looking at, okay, in order to get to an atmosphere that can really support humanity, we need to take out the pollution that we've put in, take out that excess CO2. Most people don't realize that getting to net zero will leave us at a place where we still have about 1 trillion tons of excess CO2 in the atmosphere. And that CO2 doesn't just disappear, it continues warming our planet. And we can get to a stable climate at a level that is not acceptable for civilization. But why don't we instead focus on building up the infrastructure needed to get all of that excess CO2 out of the atmosphere so that we can get to a point where we know that humanity and our natural world can survive. So climate restoration is working on getting to that safe and healthy point by the year 2050.
It's a really big goal, and clearly, we'll talk about proactive optimism later. But I think I think you really do have to be optimistic to believe that this is possible, and that's something that I'm a big believer in. Is we really need to believe that this is possible. So how exactly are you doing that, and what is the Foundation for Climate Restoration really focusing on to make sure that we're actually able to restore the climate?
Great question. When we started out as an organization, we figured, okay, the problem is simple, right? There's too much CO2, so we need to take it out of the atmosphere. So we just need whatever technological or natural solutions are available to get that CO2 out. But when we started really looking around, we found that there are a lot of carbon dioxide removal solutions, both technological and natural, that are already being developed, but they're not getting implemented or scaled up at the rate needed.
Mm-hmm.
So we realized it's not enough to just work on the solution side. You really need to create the enabling environment, create the ecosystem that will allow for climate restoration to take place. So that's our strategy, is to work across sectors so that this can all happen. So that means that we work primarily in 3 areas: solutions, of course, but perhaps more importantly, education and advocacy. So that means that we need to raise awareness of climate restoration as a goal and work with policymakers and advocates to ensure that the policy environment is conducive to climate restoration. So that means, things like there's a tax credit called 45Q that rewards the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's not a perfect bill, but it does really help with some of these new solutions out there for carbon dioxide removal to get funded because it makes them more price competitive. So identifying policy opportunities like that can really have an impact on climate restoration implementation.
I've spoken to a number of people, experts in the field and all sorts of different individuals who are working on solutions towards climate reduction, or really just solving these big challenges that we face with the environment. And the one consistent message I hear from everyone, or from most at least, is education. It all starts with education, and ultimately, the way I understand that is, if we don't know what the problem is, then it becomes very difficult to actually look for a solution. So that's the first step of education. And then the second step is really understanding what the solutions are. But how does the Foundation for Climate Restoration really see that piece of education? When you say that, education and raising awareness, what does that actually mean to you on a more, I suppose, logistical or practical level?
A few different things. So we have started out our educational offerings with the youngest cohort. So we've created a very cool digital lesson for kids aged 8 through 12. Mm-hmm. The reason that we started that young is, one, because the kids of that age are generally able to read and take themselves through a self-guided lesson. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, I know that there are a lot of parents of young children who are so discouraged by the situation with climate change that they can't bring themselves to talk to their kids about it.
Wow.
But if the kids are learning about climate change in a way that leaves them empowered and optimistic about the future, that really opens the door for communication among families. So we're working now on expanding our educational offerings for different age groups with that same kind of idea in mind, that an optimistic outlook can really unlock a lot of engagement in climate restoration. So we're working on digital lessons for adults, high school students, etc. We're also working on creating a curriculum for high school students that's aligned with AP and IB standards, so that teachers as well as students can really bring this learning to the classroom. So I think that ultimately what we really want to see is, I mentioned at the beginning, it's hard to understand climate restoration without seeing how mitigation and adaptation are kind of currently running. Most people don't even know that net zero won't restore the climate, right? Mm-hmm. We've been focusing so long on reducing emissions that there's this implicit assumption that once we get to net zero, our job is done. And it can be really hard for people to accept that there's so much more that needs to be done. But if you do it in a way that leaves them feeling good about, not only our chances to do it, but also the impact that it can have on the global community and climate justice and, environmental safety, that can really make a huge difference. So we'd love to see for the global community to not only be more educated about climate change and climate restoration, but also to feel empowered to become active in that space.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think the point about net zero, to me, now that you're really focusing on it and talking about it, it's occurring to me that net zero seems kind of like that's when we actually, if we think of climate restoration as a marathon, net zero is sort of the starting line, and so we're just kind of like getting to the starting point, because net zero is, I mean, that's an important milestone to hit, but
Absolutely.
I mean, at that point, that's kind of like just the beginning. So yeah, it's a really interesting way to look at it. And I think just going back to the education part and starting with ages 8 through 12, when I heard that, I personally, I think actually it's a brilliant age to start at, because kids have a lot of influence at home, and also I think it's becoming just part of everyone's understanding that, you know, we have these environmental challenges that we're facing, and kids are aware of this, and ultimately it's a great way to shape sort of their motivation and what they're hoping to maybe you know, what do I want to be when I grow up? Well, maybe something about protecting the environment. It's a great way to begin that thought process and the education process associated with that. And another point that there's so many points based on what you just said. I was thinking, in Italy, they, at least I've seen that they've introduced climate change as a point of study in schools there. So I think it's incredible that you're looking at introducing it into high schools as actually part of the curriculum. That's really incredible, and I think, again, just off the back of, you know, really encouraging students on what they can learn, I think it's a very empowering way to actually give you know, young adults a way to decide how they want to contribute moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. I'm so excited to see that news about Italy. I just saw that this morning, and oh my gosh, that's such a great thing.
Yeah.
You know, there's definitely been an increasing demand for climate literacy and climate education. And I know it can be really hard on teachers who are already so overextended to then do the extra research and figure out, you know, what to bring to their classroom. So we really want to make it as easy as possible for teachers to implement climate restoration curriculum, or at least, you know, a climate restoration lesson that aligns with the things that they already need to be teaching, that doesn't require them to be experts in the subject before they dive in, and that's really engaging and interactive for students.
Yeah, 100%. So moving away from the education side and more on the solution side. So we're the idea is pre-industrial levels by 2050, and I've seen this referred to as the fourth industrial revolution. What does the fourth industrial revolution mean?
You know, that's not an area of expertise for me, so I won't speak too much to that. But what I will say is there are a lot of solutions out there that are technologically driven, right? And I think that makes people nervous sometimes, the idea that we would be, I mean, the Industrial Revolution is what got us into this mess. What would we be doing with another Industrial Revolution with more technology that can, you know, cause environmental harm? So I think it's important to point out that pretty much all of the technological solutions that are out there really just look at how does nature sequester CO2 and mimic that with technology. So there is a lot of research being done to ensure that there aren't unintended side effects of these technologies. But for the most part, they're really just taking things that happen in nature and making them happen faster at a larger scale in a lab. The other thing to point out is that there are a lot of solutions that really beautifully blend technology and nature. For example, I know the Jonas Salk Institute has an initiative where they're focusing on increasing the amount of CO2 that plants put back into the soil through their root systems by breeding plants that have more extensive root systems. And there are so many really amazing ways to just improve the effectiveness of nature using technology so that we can use these existing natural solutions to enhance our carbon dioxide removal capacity.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so when it comes to using any kind of solution for climate restoration, we're really focused on assessing the fit of a solution to the goal of climate restoration. So for example, there are some solutions out there that are really cool, like you can take CO2 from the atmosphere and put it into your Coca-Cola. And so your bubbles are actually coming from atmospheric CO2. I think that's really neat. Or you can take that atmospheric CO2 and turn it into diamonds and have, fine luxury jewelry that's made from the air. And again, that's amazing. And I think these innovations really help build the industry in terms of, helping us learn how to make viable commercial products from this waste material that's been causing climate change. And yet, it's important to keep in mind that, we don't have enough of a market for diamonds globally to make a really big dent in our atmospheric CO2 by turning it into diamonds. Mm-hmm. And if you put the CO2 into a carbonated beverage, when you drink that beverage, the CO2 is re-released into the atmosphere, so it's not permanently stored. So we really try to focus on scalability, permanence, and financeability. So that last one I haven't really addressed yet. Financeability just means is there a market for this? Is there someone who will pay for it? So we really look at, with all of the things that are out there, there's no bad way to be removing CO2 from the atmosphere as long as it's, safe and environmentally just. Mm-hmm. But there are ways that are not going to get us to climate restoration. So in terms of our goal, we really want to be focusing on solutions that meet those criteria, scalability, financeability, and permanence, because those are the ones that can do the bulk of the heavy lifting to get us to our goal.
Yeah, I mean, on that point of permanence, I think carbon removal technologies, there are some pretty interesting ones. A similar kind of idea of basically a big vacuum cleaner that sucks in a bunch of air and then removes the carbon. I've seen similar to what you were talking about of putting it into a carbonated beverage. You can actually inject a bunch of CO2 into a greenhouse. Mm-hmm. And have, tomatoes or whatever in there, just be very, very happy in this CO2 rich environment. Or of course you can basically just pull it or inject it into the ground and have it turn into liquid. First it becomes liquid and then it eventually settles as a stone as part of it. And that kind of technology is really incredible. And I think from a scalability perspective, I think it's very scalable. It's really just a big fan and you have to just build a pipe down. So
the capacity for geologic storage like that, where you're pumping CO2 into the ground, is just incredibly massive. And if you look at, where is most of the carbon in our planetary systems, right? There's a finite amount of carbon in our planetary system, but that carbon comes in all kinds of different forms. So while there's been a variable amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, when it's not in the atmosphere, it's something else. And typically what it is rock. So 99.5, I think, % of all of the carbon in our planetary system is in the form of rock. And a lot of that's in the form of limestone. So that the idea of turning CO2 into rock, either below ground, like you were saying, by pumping it underground and having it mineralize, or you can actually do something relatively similar in a lab and create rock that you can sell into our global market for rock is one of the largest markets in the world. It's the second most used material after water on our planet. Silica. Mainly limestone, actually.
Is that right? Okay, wow.
Yeah. But it's a huge opportunity to store a ton or a trillion tons of CO2 in a way that's really stable, that there's a market for, et cetera. So I think one of the main limitations when it comes to the geologic storage underground is who's going to pay for it. Mm-hmm. And so fortunately, we're seeing an increasing number of corporate commitments to becoming carbon negative or at least carbon neutral on a faster timeline than our global community. And so that's really helping drive the demand, which will, in turn drive the supply of that geologic sequestration that, as you mentioned, is relatively easy, very stable, and there's just a ton of capacity for it.
Yeah, and permanence, of course.
Exactly.
Another solution that I'm seeing a lot more interest in, which personally I'm also very interested in, is regenerative agriculture. Because the more I'm seeing about it, the more you really mimic the way nature works in sort of the wild, and you apply those same ideas and principles to farming. Actually, there could be a lot of potential in carbon sequestration in the soil. Similar idea of rock, but it really is a soil. It gets it stays in the soil, and you end up actually having very organic, high quality food as well as a result. And the more I'm learning about it, the more I'm realizing it's actually more beneficial for the farmer as well, because these kind of systems typically increase profitability. They need to spend less on all sorts of inputs like fertilizer and pesticides, and it's at all the other sides, which ends up making them and their families healthier. So there's a lot of benefits, not to mention, the soil is more stable in general, so you have less runoff, which then doesn't go into the ocean. So that's a very interesting. Is that something that you're looking at as well, and supporting farmers and moving in that direction?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is a very exciting opportunity. I will say there are limitations, especially when it comes to just monitoring, reporting, and verification.
Yeah.
So this kind of blew my mind when I first found out, but with most of the carbon removal credits that come from soil carbon, they're measuring soil carbon by hand by taking a vial of soil from somewhere in a field and sending it to a lab to be analyzed.
Wow.
And, there is additional technology that's being developed that can use, satellite imaging to do a more robust analysis of soil carbon. But if you think about it, like there's, even in my backyard, right, there's so much variability in the type and the characteristics of the soil. So if you think about a 1,000-acre farm, that's a small farm, and that's just a ton of variability that you're not able to capture. And while soil can become more stable with a higher carbon content, you can also undo that pretty easily by going back to kind of industrial farming practices. A lot of tilling and upturning the soil releases a lot of that carbon. So it's challenging. And I'm really excited to see the advances that are happening, because like you mentioned, the co-benefits make it so worth pursuing, even though there are so many questions that still remain unanswered.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And as far as this idea of a global carbon removal partnership, is what we're talking about directly tied into this, or is that something slightly different?
It is definitely tied in. So the Global Carbon Removal Partnership is focused on developing the policies and markets that will allow for large-scale carbon removal to take place. So definitely I think we've been talking about the market aspect. What does it take for more corporations to make carbon negative pledges? What does it take for more money to flow into voluntary carbon removal marketplaces? These are springing up all over the place. So what's holding them back, and what are the different characteristics of the various markets out there? What can we do to improve the recognition that corporations get when they go beyond what's expected of them, and really move the global corporate markets into this new carbon negative direction? So they're really focused on bringing together stakeholders across sectors to start answering those questions, and building some of the infrastructure needed to move forward there.
That's really cool. I mean, it sounds like it's a way to encourage just a lot of collaboration in areas that may have otherwise, not areas rather, but people who may have otherwise not really considered working together or speaking together, and really creating a forum for discussion in order to meet this goal of 1 trillion tons of carbon sequestered.
Exactly. Yeah, it's been really fun to watch the collaboration that takes place. One of the things that they're working on right now is developing a list of carbon removal principles. And when you think about, there are so many ways one can remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and not all of them are created equal, right? So having corporations and nonprofits and people working on the carbon dioxide removal solutions and policymakers all working together to create that set of common principles that really guides the carbon dioxide removal industry is very exciting.
Just on this point of not all carbon removal solutions are created equal, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind when I hear something about carbon removal solutions, I start thinking of Project Drawdown, which outlines 100 technologies or solutions that it's not necessarily technologies, it's really solutions that we have available to us today. And this list has been around for some time now that could actually help us reach our climate goals. And the idea of Project Drawdown, I suppose, is in fact what you're referring to of climate restoration as well, where we're actually removing CO2 from the environment, from the atmosphere, and bringing things back to hopefully normal. So is there any collaboration between you and Project Drawdown?
Yeah, definitely. I will say their goal is slightly different from ours, and that they're looking at reaching that inflection point, which is getting just past net zero, just starting to get net negative. So a lot of their solutions are looking at the mitigation side. So how do we reduce emissions or avoid emissions, more so than actually drawing the CO2 out of the atmosphere.
I gotcha.
But with that said, their approach to evaluating different solutions has been really helpful in guiding our work, and we have collaborated with them quite a bit. I think the book Drawdown as well has really opened people's eyes to the possibility of becoming carbon negative in a way that really most people have never even considered before.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's a really interesting distinction because I think we need to come at it from both sides. We need to mitigate and remove, because if we're just removing and there's no mitigation happening, it makes the job substantially more difficult.
Exactly. Yeah, we like to use the analogy of a bathtub. So mitigation is focusing on turning down the faucet, and restoration is focusing on opening the drain. And of course, there's no point in, opening the drain when the faucet is on full blast. You're not going to get to climate restoration if you don't also do the mitigation. But similarly, if you turn the faucet off and you don't open the drain, then you're not any better off either. So yeah, it's critical that these work hand in hand.
Yeah, very good. It's a very good point. And as far as partnerships, you have a really exciting partnership coming up before the Glasgow COP 26, which is the Countdown Summit in partnership with TED. What is that? I mean, I think it's so cool to see that you're working with an organization like TED, which is really, in some ways, like the ultimate education platform. What is your partnership there?
Yeah, we've been lucky enough to work with the leadership of TED Countdown, and they're really focusing on this whole year of climate programming and climate education. So we've been able to work with them on sort of the messaging that's gone around the Countdown programming, and we're also hosting our own TEDx event as part of the Countdown program, which is planned for the second half of this year, and will focus, of course, on climate restoration.
Yeah, I think it's great because TED has such a wide reach, and so many people love watching these the TED Talks. I mean, they've turned it into a science, and so from the point of view of educating and really raising awareness, as we were talking about earlier, it's such a phenomenal platform to have access to and get involved with, and it happens right before. It's like, isn't it 2 or 3 weeks before COP?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, well, that's super cool. So good luck with that, and I hope it goes really well.
Thank you.
Moving over to kind of away from the logistics of climate restoration and everything we've been talking about, and over into your other area of expertise of eco-anxiety and proactive optimism. So eco-anxiety is a term that we're, I think, encountering more and more. If we start with that, what is eco-anxiety?
Eco-anxiety is really exactly what you expect it to be. It's the anxiety about our climate and our environment that can cause people to feel just hopeless about the future of our planet.
Yeah, I've come across this term called doomism, which I think my understanding is basically things are so bad, or they seem so bad, that you just shut off, and it's complete apathy, which is probably the worst place we could be in, is just not caring at all and just thinking someone else will deal with it. I just don't want to know.
Yeah, before I started working on this, I was right there myself. I was working in the field of international development, and anyone who works in that field can tell you that climate change is just a critical factor in the success or failure of international development programs, right? If you're doing agricultural extension programs, but there's a drought, the best intentions are not going to lead to healthy crops, right? So I was working in this field and very aware of the importance and the impact of climate change, but I was so overwhelmed by it that I just didn't want anything to do with it. Some of my colleagues were working on, evaluating climate change activities, and I was like, oh, thank God someone else is doing this. I don't have to engage. Like, there are brilliant people working on this. I'm going to just stay as far as possible. And what I found was that, once I actually started working on it, my level of anxiety went down dramatically.
Interesting.
Not only because I had a better understanding of what was actually being done and what wasn't, but also because acting in a way that aligns with your values, especially around the climate, can just give you a sense of peace and empowerment that really counteracts that anxiety.
And so is that what proactive optimism is all about, or there's a slightly different?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the things that I love about working on climate restoration is that it really takes this idea of, it's not helpful to sit there and think that the world is going to end. Not only because it's not grounded in action, but also because it really precludes action, right? So if you really want people to become activated around climate change, we've had this philosophy for decades now that people just need to be scared into action. And I think as a result, we have, especially young people right now are just scared out of action. They want nothing to do with it because they know that they're doomed. So coming to climate restoration, where our whole philosophy is based on, let's work for the outcome that we want. Let's work for a world that can sustain humanity and our natural world. And having the actions that can align with that goal really leave people feeling much more at peace psychologically in a way that allows them to really get into action.
I couldn't agree more. That's, precisely what Sustainability Champions is all about. And I think from my point of view, and from what we at Sustainability Champions are doing and what we stand for, it all came about really because I got tired of opening or reading the news and only seeing doom and gloom about the environment. And of course, that's not always fair. You do get some really positive stories as well in the media, but predominantly, this idea of scaring people into action. Sustainability Champions is sort of a counter action to that, and it's all about highlighting people who are seeing these exact challenges that we're talking about and actually choosing to do something about it. And I think the idea really is about that the solution that you come up with doesn't have to be perfect. It can be kind of creative, a little funky, a little bit out there, but it all helps. And you may, by taking action, you may inspire someone else, and you are beginning your journey as well on finding a solution that does work. And I suppose in an ideal world, the idea of Sustainability Champions is people see all these other individuals taking action, and that motivates them to say, I can be one of them too. It doesn't really, you don't have to, invent the next carbon sequestration thing that, shoots stuff from, and, it doesn't have to be very sciencey or like anything. It could literally just be picking up trash when you see it littering on the street, or taking a reusable bag to the store. And it creates this big ripple effect that you may not even be aware of just by doing something as simple as that. So I think when I saw that term proactive optimism, it clicked so much with what we're doing. So is that, I mean, how are you encouraging proactive optimism?
A few different ways. I would say the biggest one is through our local chapters program. So we have a grassroots network that we've been growing over the last 6 months, and we'll be really ramping up over the coming year. And the local chapters are really intended to provide an opportunity for individuals to participate in the climate restoration movement. And that includes raising awareness through our educational opportunities and, giving presentations on climate restoration and advocacy, and particularly advocacy with a mind to have volunteers take on more than they realized they could do. Really work with policymakers at the local level, write op-eds and letters to the editor, and just become active in a way that is new to them and can really give them a larger sense of themselves and their individual abilities. The other thing I'll mention is I think that there's some issues in the climate action space with people getting so wound up, acting out of fear, that it can become really stressful to be in action because you never feel like you're doing enough. So the other thing I try to do is just point out that a lot of the narrative of individual responsibility for climate change is being pushed by the largest polluters out there, and the corporations that bear the most responsibility for climate change. It's a lot easier for them to push the responsibility onto individuals than it is for them to clean up their own act. So as much as I encourage people to take the actions that work for them and leave them feeling empowered and like they're part of the solution, I try to encourage people away from taking actions that leave them feeling frenzied and like the situation is really out of their control. I think ultimately that type of individual action where you feel the need to throw out every plastic bag from your mother-in-law's house ultimately is not as effective and leaves you out of energy for some of the bigger actions that are needed.
I think it's a really good point. Yeah, I suppose it comes down to focus on what you can control, and and I suppose, is it Catherine Hayhoe talks about the idea of what can we do about climate change is the best thing we can do about climate change is talk about it. And I guess from that point of view of rather than going in and being all passive aggressive and throwing plastic bags out, having a conversation and really explaining how it works, why it's important, and little actions that can be taken can really make a big difference. I'm just seeing a comment from Karen Venner asking for a link. So I'm imagining, Karen, that you're referring to the link of the Foundation for Climate Restoration, which I'll just post now. Hopefully you can see that. And if you can't, I will just say it's foundationforclimaterestoration.org.
You can also get there at f4cr.org.
f4cr.org. And if you meant a different link, Karen, just let us know. I'm curious to know, Erica, when was really the moment that you realized this is the work that you want to do?
Yeah, I had a conversation with the founder of the foundation about 4 years ago. And I was at a point where I was working on my PhD in evaluation of international development programs. And as I mentioned, trying my hardest to stay away from climate change, even though it was intruding on all of my best intentions. And it was the first time that I had heard this idea that we could actually work towards a future that works for everyone, that climate change doesn't have to be this basically the end of the world or the end of humanity, right? That climate change could be like the greatest opportunity humanity has ever had to come together and innovate ourselves out of this disaster. And the idea that there was hope in what seemed like a hopeless situation just really grabbed me. And I've been thrilled, whenever I have conversations with new people about climate restoration, seeing the look on their face when they understand for the first time that there are solutions and this is not hopeless it just really makes everything worthwhile.
I think you're absolutely right. There is so much freedom that comes from kind of lifting that fear off of your own shoulders, and if you can provide that to others, I think it's one of the best services that can be done today. And I think going back to this idea of doomism and getting scared out of action, by lifting that fear off of people, all of a sudden they feel like, oh, well, then maybe I should chip in. What can I do?
Exactly.
Which is absolutely phenomenal. So, I mean, what are some looking ahead? What are some future innovations that you'd like to see that perhaps were not quite there yet, or that you've heard about that may be interesting to develop further?
So one thing that sounds really boring, but that I get very excited about, is procurement legislation that focuses on low carbon building materials. So I don't think most people think about this kind of thing, but the concrete industry in particular is one of the biggest sources of emissions on the planet. And I mentioned the huge opportunity that comes from mineralizing CO2 into rock and how huge that rock market is. So there are probably a dozen companies at this point using different types of innovations to make concrete either carbon neutral or carbon negative. And it's just incredible how much opportunity there is, but most people don't know about it, including policymakers. So one of the things that we're working on through our local chapters program, and will absolutely be focusing on over the coming years, is raising awareness about these opportunities for carbon removal through building materials, and helping people adopt legislation that requires the use, or at least incentivizes the use, of carbon neutral or carbon negative building materials in the infrastructure projects. I think the other thing people don't realize is that governments at all levels are really the biggest purchasers of concrete in the world. It's really not individuals, it's all of the roads and buildings that our governments build. Yes, so by adopting legislation, even that just changes the way that governments go about looking at the bids that come in for their infrastructure projects, you can have a huge, huge impact in our emissions and eventually our capacity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, I've heard the cement industry is like 8% of carbon emissions worldwide.
Exactly.
And if you compare that to airplanes, I mean, I know that some presidents and some prime ministers showed up to the G7 conference in an airplane, but if you compare it to the cement industry, airlines are 2%. And I would imagine of carbon emissions, and I would imagine over the last, let's just call it 2 years, that number has drastically dropped. So yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting opportunity. Just reading Elliot Bint's comment saying, a global conversation that brings all of us together to work towards the same goal. Let's hope the conversation reaches everyone. And I think Absolutely. That's precisely the point. Just on this idea of, I suppose, procurement legislation, but also future innovations, I'm curious to know, this is something I've been thinking about. The movement towards electric vehicles is something that, well, I mean, we're seeing it a lot around the world. And I know in the UK, for instance, if I'm not mistaken, by 2030 or 2035, there will be no more sales of petrol or gas or diesel vehicles, which is a huge step. And clearly, the government's taking this very, very seriously. I'm wondering to know, I'm wondering rather, what are the sort of unintended consequences of moving into that direction when, for instance, yes, that means that there's zero emissions at the tailpipe, but what about the emissions required from actually creating all of the materials to run an electric, or to create an electric vehicle? Is this something that's being discussed or looked into?
It is. I think the good news here is that even when you take into account all of the components that go into building electric vehicles, they still come out way ahead of internal combustion vehicles.
Fantastic.
There's an excellent podcast episode on, what was it called? To Save a Planet? It's the one with Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Alex Bloomfield. But anyways, Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, they have really wonderfly in-depth episodes on kind of all of the most common environmental and climate questions. And they have, I think, 2 episodes now on electric vehicles, and they really look into all of that detail. And I mean, even they were surprised at how definitively electric vehicles come out ahead of internal combustion cars.
Oh, that's incredible. Yeah, it's so it's called How to Save a Planet with Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Alex Bloomberg. I'll take a look at that. Yeah, that sounds fascinating, because it's a really, really interesting point about, how can it would be a great shame if everyone's moving towards electric vehicles and it turns out actually it produces a lot more carbon. Just looking at one more comment from Balas Urdai, who says, I have to agree that especially in industries with the higher percentage of global emissions, international and government policy regulations have a major role to play. Everywhere else, it's going to have to be us, citizens, changing our ways and pressuring businesses to follow suit. I think just on that second half, that's one thing I really believe in capitalism, as far as being able to, we as individuals have the ability to demand change, and that informs and shapes supply. You mentioned that the Industrial Revolution got us into this mess. I also believe that if capitalism got us into this mess, then I think capitalism or some form of it can get us out of it as well through really supply and demand.
And I think you really speak to, the most important thing, which is the power of using your voice as a citizen, whether it's, speaking to policymakers or writing letters to corporations or even voting with your dollars, buying things that are aligned with your values. I really try to discourage people from thinking like my individual choice to bike to work today is going to save the climate. But, pair that with writing to your city government to, encourage the use of electric vehicles, or creating the infrastructure that allows for them to really take place, or getting procurement legislation. Those opportunities to use your voice as a citizen to impact change is really huge. Absolutely. And as we were saying before, it's about approaching it from all angles. It's not just one solution is the only answer. This is, as you said, it's one of the greatest opportunities, which also means that it may be the greatest challenges we face, but with humongous challenges comes massive opportunities. So Martin de Haan says, I think the, quote, right to repair is an important aspect in order to produce less. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, France recently did some sort of legislation about that, or encouraging really about repairing items. And there's some sort of tax incentive to create products that are easy to repair rather than really easy to just throw away and get a new one. You mentioned How to Save a Planet, which is a great recommendation. Are there any other sustainability leaders that you admire, or perhaps books or other podcasts or TV shows or movies, really anything that you could recommend? Oh gosh, so many. So to name a few things, there's a film called 2040, and it really does a beautiful job of being solution oriented and optimistic. And it really highlights some of the solutions that I think are potentially most impactful in the world. So I highly recommend that. Again, the film is called 2040. If you're interested in carbon dioxide removal technology, there's a podcast called Reversing Climate Change, and they interview innovators in the space and get really in depth in how these different solutions work and what it takes for them to scale up, what challenges they face. Of course, How to Save a Planet, I already mentioned. And My Climate Journey is another one that I think is very friendly to people who are new to the space and moves through a lot of the most important questions about climate change, climate action, and carbon dioxide removal. Yeah, great recommendations. Thank you. I've heard of 2040 and I haven't had a chance to watch it yet because what I've liked about it is that it's very solutions orientated, and there's this, from what I understand, a feeling of optimism
after you finish watching it.
The other thing I love about it is that it's made by a father who's looking at his daughter's future and saying, what will it take for my daughter to have a future that she can thrive in? And I think that's a question that so many parents right now are asking is, is it even possible for my children to have a future that will allow them to thrive? So I love that it took that perspective and really dove in really deeply.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's from that point of view, it becomes extremely solutions orientated. It's not just, we can't do anything, but rather, I need to find a way to make this work for my child. Blas recommends checking out a company called EvoCo, EVOCCO. They're developing an app for grocery shoppers to be able to monitor their carbon footprint, their choices, and the carbon footprints associated with those. Moving over to kind of what we as individuals can do, and we've talked a little bit already about having our voices heard, and perhaps this is the most effective thing. Are there any other things that people can do on a daily basis to really help us reach this idea of climate restoration?
Yeah, I think it'll be more exciting in about a decade when there are more individual choices people can make that support the growth of the carbon removal industry. Right now, the main thing you can do aside from using your voice is reducing your personal carbon footprint. Again, going back to that bathtub analogy, right now, it's really up to the big decision makers to choose to build the capacity to open that drain on our carbon dioxide. So really the place where individuals at this point have the most control is over that faucet, choosing to reduce the amount of CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere. And, I can rattle off a few different things people can do, but these are the things that you're already familiar with, right? It's like choosing public transportation or a bicycle over a car when you can, or buying an electric vehicle as your next car if you don't already have one. It's choosing to eat produce that was produced locally, that was, produced using the best agricultural practices, things like that. And again, I really caution people against thinking that your individual choices are going to be the thing that makes the difference. I think the individual choices that leave you empowered and that leave you with energy to use your voice are the most important things, because ultimately it's up to the biggest polluters and the policymakers and the corporations to make choices that will shift our direction globally.
Yeah, I suppose it sounds to me like it's really the 80-20 rule of, let's focus on the 20% that will make the 80% shift in carbon reduction. And then I suppose once we can really have a solid handle on that 80%, then we can start, getting to 81, 82. But yeah, being able to really focus on the big 20% is where we'll see the biggest advances.
Exactly.
And so where for people who want to get involved and for people who really want to learn more about the Foundation for Climate Restoration, where is the best place to go to see everything you're working on?
Yeah, our website is really the best place. So that link is in the chat. And again, it's f4cr.org. On our resources page, you'll find all kinds of resources. I would, especially if you happen to be a parent of young children or a teacher, I would encourage you to check out the Climate Restoration for Kids lesson, which is on that page. And there's a teacher's guide that goes along with it as well. So if you're a teacher, it can make it really easy to implement something like this in your classroom. I would also encourage people, if you're interested in getting involved, of course, we are a nonprofit, so all donations are tax deductible, but also we have a robust and growing volunteer program. So if you're interested in joining or creating a local chapter, definitely go to that page. If you have a young person in your life, age 13 to 24, encourage them to apply for our Youth Leaders Program, which is a robust 12-week introduction to climate change and climate restoration. And yeah, visit our social media for any regular updates.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Dodds, thank you again very much for your time. So just wanted to thank you and the team at the Foundation for Climate Restoration for all the work that you're doing, and for the optimism that you're providing, because I think it's really important. And as we talked about, without this proactive optimism, it's hard to see how we're actually going to be able to achieve the goals of sequestering 1 trillion tons of CO2 by 2050. But the fact that you believe that it's possible, and that you're encouraging others to see it as well, and that you're moving this agenda forward, I think it's really it's very important. It's crucial, and it's probably the only way to do it. So thank you very much for all the work you're doing.
Thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for the work you do.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for listening. Take care.